There's going to be no circumstance where you see people being lifted off the roof of a embassy of the United States from Afghanistan. It is not at all comfortable.
Hello, and welcome to Banfield. I don't know if you could remember all the way back to July 8th. That was President Biden promising barely a month ago that Kabul 2021 would in no way resemble Saigon 1975. And here we are. Afghan civilians, men, women, families, willing to risk being run over by a U.S. government transport plane, or indeed even fall from it from the sky, rather than live under a Taliban regime that was able to retake control of that entire country in little more than a week. I was speaking literally about Afghans falling from that American aircraft, because many of them didn't get off, and that plane took off. And multiple sources are reporting that at least 2 people tied themselves to the wheels of that plane and fell to their deaths after takeoff. We are not going to air those images in their entirety. But that image on your screen, right there, both of those, in fact, such as the desperation now of this 20 years war, right? The final moments, which make comparisons to Vietnam as chilling as they are impossible to ignore, impossible. These Afghans, these ones, they're in safety tonight. Hundreds, more than 600 of them, somewhere outside Afghanistan, breathing freely. They were scrambled onto an outgoing U.S. cargo plane, desperate to push their way on board. And reportedly, the crew just did not have the heart to force anybody off. And so they took off inside that plane. President Biden spoke to the nation again today and said, if the collapse of Afghanistan came sooner than expected, and it did, that it's not America's fault.
I stand squarely behind my decision. After 20 years, I've learned the hard way that there was never a good time to withdraw U.S. forces. American troops cannot and should not be fighting in a war and dying in a war that Afghan forces are not willing to fight for themselves.
And so comes to mind the words of another president after another war that was grimly inconclusive until it was grimly conclusive. And I'm, of course, speaking of this war, the Vietnam War. In 1999, you may have missed this, but looking back on that war, former President Gerald R. Ford said this, and I'll quote him. The passage of time has not dulled the ache of those days, the saddest of my public life. I pray that no future American president is ever faced with the grim options that confronted me as the military situation on the ground deteriorated, mediating between those who wanted an early exit and others who would go down with all flags flying, running a desperate race against the clock to rescue as many people as we could before enemy shelling destroyed airport runways, followed by the heartbreaking realization that as refugees streamed out onto those runways, we were left with only one alternative: a final evacuation by helicopter from the roof of the embassy. Hard to believe. All of that 44 years ago, and here we are. I want to introduce you to a journalist who you should remember. He was there for that Vietnam War, and he was there for this Afghan war, and he has been there for countless others. Peter Arnett won a Pulitzer for his Vietnam coverage and worldwide fame with his live reports from the first Gulf War on CNN in 1991. He covered Afghanistan when the Soviets came and when the Soviets left. And he covered Afghanistan when the U.S. came and the U.S. left. And here we are again. The U.S. came again and left again. I'm thrilled he's here to share his thoughts on this endgame. Peter, I never thought that you and I would gather and talk about this topic. Maybe others, but not this topic. I'd love to get your thoughts.
You know, Ashleigh, it's great to be with you. And it's my audio was not good here on the base of San Francisco, that I'd like to offer my thoughts, having covered the collapse of the South Vietnamese army in 1975. Now, referring to the Washington Post scoop last week of basically the secret documents on the Afghanistan war. They discovered a whole trove of documents that revealed how the U.S. Government, a series of governments, have been lying to the American public about the war in Afghanistan. And that takes me back to Vietnam, where the Pentagon Papers were revealed in 1971, that they also showed that at that time, the Johnson administration and earlier administrations had been lying to the American public about what was happening in that war, giving optimistic assessments. And this made ultimately the fall of Saigon much more difficult, because so many South Vietnamese were under the impression that the war was being won and that would all be well. And I think that's the case today, where Americans must be asking each other, what happened? We've just had so much optimism expressed about what was going on in Afghanistan, and it's all collapsed that we can see today. So I think that's very unfortunate, Ashleigh, that has been happening to the American public.
So, Peter, what's so frustrating is that, for 45 years, you have watched these kinds of images, and I keep wondering, when are we going to learn? You cannot pick up stakes and run. You must protect your own people and those who protect you. And we're seeing the same kinds of images almost to a T. Other than the top of the embassy, we're seeing people clambering up a sky bridge trying to get onto a plane to escape. It's frustrating to think that we didn't learn the lessons from Vietnam and we've repeated them.
I think that those of us who covered the Vietnam War did believe at the end, at its conclusion, that there were important lessons learned by the United States. They would have to learn that you can't commit to a conflict nation building if you have if you're working with a population who doesn't approve really what you're doing, who don't quite fully understand why you are there. You don't understand the subtleties of the nationalism of the people you're working with. And this was the case, of course, in Afghanistan, not just for the United States, but for the Russians. I first really encountered Afghanistan when I walked in to the war in 1982 on assignment for Parade magazine. Now, why did I go with Parade magazine? I was new to CNN, and they weren't interested at that time to cover the Afghan war. I walked in, I stayed 3 weeks with a Mujahideen unit. They expressed their determination to defeat the Russians, this communism, this foreign presence that was opposed to their own Islam ideology. The Russians, of course, had gone in to support a communist leadership, communist president, and tried to enforce his rule in provinces around Afghanistan. Now, the U.S. CIA paid millions to support the Mujahideens that were opposed to the Russians, and playing on the fact that the Russians didn't understand the real nationalism and the unity of people with Afghanistan against foreigners. So here we are, I mean, 30 years later, willingly going into Afghanistan with a good reason at that time because of 9/11, but also getting bogged down there in following the
Bogged
same
down.
kind of
That's it.
pattern of
Bogged down is
policy.
a good way. So, and I apologize for our delay, Peter, but there is something that the president said today, and I think you have specific wisdom on how this could play out. He said that America will make its best efforts to rescue 30,000 of the SVIs, the special immigrant visa holders. Those are the people who helped America for the last 20 years, who had our back. 30,000 people, Peter, out of Kabul, where America has no control over any dirt other than the airport. How will they cherry pick those people, as well as the remaining Americans who've been told to shelter in place somewhere in the city? How will they find them? How will they get all those people out, or will they?
You know, Ashleigh, I haven't been able to pick up your comments because of an audio problem at this end. But if you could simplify your question, I'll try and pick it up.
Sure, apologies. How will they get 30,000 people still
Yep.
remaining? How will they get 30,000 people still remaining in Kabul out of that city now that it's in Taliban control?
Well, Ashleigh, that is a very terrible prospect. Now, in Vietnam in 1975, when the fall of Saigon, there was a little more awareness that would happen because for a whole month, the North Vietnamese forces were moving through the country, knocking off South Vietnamese military and taking over cities. But the U.S. was in a position there. They still had, lots of military material, around Saigon. They had access to aircraft, and they were promising those integral to the American effort, those people who'd worked with the military at high levels, who'd worked with the CIA, there would be an endeavor they would be moved out of Saigon. The ambassador, Martin, he delayed the exodus because for political reasons, he believed that maybe they could come to terms with the communist forces and make Saigon sort of an international city. It didn't happen. And now the consequences for the South Vietnamese was while maybe 100,000 South Vietnamese got out that year, there were thousands of others committed to training camps, committed to torture sessions, who were imprisoned and unable to meet with their families. And it took up to 10 years for the North Vietnamese to release those South Vietnamese. In the meantime, thousands of Vietnamese were fleeing in boats to neighboring countries. Now, by facing those people in Afghanistan, as you were pointing out, the potential that the Taliban could be very brutal to them, and this is a big worry and a big concern, and I presume it is to the Biden administration.
Yeah, this is going to be quite a week, without question. Peter Arnett, it's so good of you to join us, and I'm thankful for all of your many decades of expertise and your reflections on this particular day as well. Sir, thank you. Coming up after the break, you've probably heard the statistics before, right? 2,300 U.S. personnel were killed in Afghanistan, 20,000 wounded in action, and we're not counting the civilians or the reporters. Coming up next, one reporter who lost an eye in Afghanistan and just kept going back. What was the draw? What did he learn? What does he think now? That's next.
No.
Welcome back. For the first time since the U.S. forces invaded Afghanistan back in 2001, the Taliban is now fully in charge of that country. Oh, maybe not the airport, but wait for it. It didn't take them months. It didn't take them years. It just took a couple of days. Last week, we were talking about 30 to 60 days. Now, we're talking about desperate rescues. From Zagreb, Croatia, I'm joined now by reporter and author Carmen Gentile. Carmen was conducting an interview in country in Afghanistan in 2010 when he took on fire from the Taliban, an explosion, and he lost his eye and very nearly lost his life in a Taliban ambush. He went back to Afghanistan the following year and then went back to Afghanistan many times thereafter. He's kind enough to join me tonight. Carmen, we're seeing some of the video of the injury that you sustained when you lost your eye as a war correspondent in Afghanistan. You're one of tens of thousands who were injured in Afghanistan, and I can only imagine watching the coverage today what you must be feeling. Can you describe it for us?
It's a nonstop gut punch, just having to know that my friends on the ground there are suffering so much, running for their lives, wondering what they're going to do day to day, whether they're going to be able to survive this, when the next knock on the door is going to be from the Taliban to take them away, to take away their wives, their children. It's nothing that you could possibly imagine in your worst dreams is happening right now. This what happened to me. This is nothing. This is a kiss on the cheek. What they're going to do to the Afghan people, particularly to the women and the children, is beyond comprehension, and we should all be ashamed for what's happening right now.
So I'm going to dovetail off what you just said, that we should all be ashamed. Will we be? Will Americans care after, hopefully, the Americans that are still there can be rescued from wherever they are sheltering in place in Kabul tonight? Will Americans care about the plight of those people who were so frightened they chose to hang on to a military cargo plane on takeoff on the tarmac?
It's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking to watch. It's heartbreaking to consider that so many Americans aren't moved by these photos, aren't outraged by these images of people clinging to the side of an airplane for life because it's their only hope to live another day, because what they have facing back at home is certain death or torture or things even beyond your comprehension. I don't know.
There were pictures, Carmen. I don't know if you saw the pictures even before then. There were women and children running across the tarmac with that, I think it's a C-17, if I'm not mistaken, with it just, 50 to 100 yards away, barreling towards them, women and children running across the tarmac. I mean, just to think about how frightened we'd be if they were running across I-95, but there they were running across the tarmac with a C-17 barreling towards them. Let me ask you a little bit about the comments from the president today. A lot of journalists who've been interviewed today who are still in country and some who are out of the country said that it rang very hollow to hear the president not address the core issue, that this is disastrous. This week, this month, this day is disastrous. Yes, everybody knew that we were going to have to leave sooner or later, but this way, this was a colossal American failure.
This is a failure of our values. This is a failure of our partners in Afghanistan, who, despite what President Biden said erroneously, were not fighting hard. Almost 70,000 Afghan men fighting for their country have died in uniform since the Afghan army was stood up. 70,000. Okay? Countless number of civilians have been killed. And say what you will about the efficacy of that 300,000 person strong army that put down their arms when the Taliban came. They knew what was coming. They knew because they had heard the stories already in the remote villages of what the Taliban was doing to soldiers, how they were gathering them up and not just killing them, they were mutilating them. Those stories get around Afghanistan quicker than anything that gets on Twitter, and it goes from ear to ear, from village to village. People find out about these things, and they were frightened to death. Their American partners had abandoned them. What were they going to do? They hadn't been getting paid regularly. They weren't getting fed. I've been with the Afghan soldiers. For President Biden to say that they were as well equipped and well trained as any army in the world is disgusting. It's not the case at all. They often didn't have ammunition. They didn't have fuel for their vehicles. They slept on planks without mattresses. These guys were not given everything that they could to produce. And it wasn't all the U.S.'s fault. There's a lot of corruption in Afghanistan. We would give money to the Ministry of Defense, and the Ministry of Defense would take their bit, and then it would finally trickle down, and sometimes there wasn't any money left for those soldiers that were patrolling and fighting and dying in remote corners of Afghanistan. But to say that those men were not fighting for their country is an insult. I'm ashamed.
Well, and at some point, I have to say I was there for I call it the first turban turn, when the Taliban took their black turbans off and put white turbans on and just melted into the environment with everyone else. And I dare say that many of them have just dusted them off and put the black turbans back on. And the white turbans are, waiting for the next round, because it just keeps cycling in Afghanistan. Carmen Gentile, it's good to talk to you. Thank you for the work you've done. Thank you for your bravery as well. And thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Coming up after the break, I think it's fair to say this is a pretty unsavory end to America's longest war. What does it mean for America? What does it mean for the 30,000 people, apparently, who still need to be rescued from a city that's under Taliban control through an airport that is tiny and somewhat under American control? I'm going to talk to journalist and analyst Robin Wright, who has covered this country and many others and wars and the like for decades, and has a keen eye to what may lay ahead. Welcome back. We are breaking down the breakdown of pretty much everything this country built in Afghanistan over the past 20 years. And I'm now pleased to welcome Robin Wright, New Yorker columnist and senior fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and someone I have turned to many times over the last 20 years covering Afghanistan. Robin, it's good to see you. I'm so sorry it's under these circumstances. I did not expect this. I dare say you didn't either.
Well, I have to admit, I was in Afghanistan in March, and it was clear at that point that the Taliban had seized 50% of the country, and that with the U.S. presence winding down, that the Taliban was going to get control of a good chunk of the country. What has surprised us all, I think, is the speed with which they gobbled up almost half the country in about 10 days.
And walked right into the capital of Kabul, only, by my count, I think 4 or 5 days after the Americans said it will be 30 to 60 days. To that end, Robin, there are 30,000 special immigrant visa applicants, people who helped Americans. There are still many Americans who were told to shelter in place when the Taliban rolled into town and were told not to come to the embassy. It's done. The flag is down. And not to come to the airport. So it's fine that President Biden says the mission is to get those 30,000 people out. How?
It's going to take a lot of aircraft. And remember, it's not just Americans. That the U.S. coalition involved 123 countries, many of them from the West, whether it's Germany or France or Canada or Britain or Australia or Japan. All of them have Afghans who work for them as interpreters, as local staff, as facilitators. Then there are all the NGOs, the non-government organizations that were critical in developing a civil society, in promoting women's rights and human rights. All of these who have links to the United States, to Western governments, and the challenge will be to get all of these people out. The intention, of course, was to try to evacuate everyone by August 31st, the original date for the final withdrawal of U.S. forces. It now looks like it may be far more complicated, partly because of the failure to map out a thoughtful plan, partly because the Taliban is on the outskirts of the airport and they're not allowing anyone in the airport. to go back into Kabul. So the airport is becoming, kind of a cesspool at the moment for everyone who wants out. And then, of course, as you point out, there are a lot of Americans or dual nationals who hold both American and Afghan citizenship who want out and may not even be in Kabul. But getting to Kabul is going to be very difficult. And almost anyone would get stopped by one of the checkpoints. I've been through them myself during the Taliban's rule in the 1990s, where they will ask what their intent is, where they're going, what role they may have played during the 20 years of the Western, the coalition presence. And so it's going to be very hard to get people out.
Robin, do you suspect, and I'm just, as I'm looking at the pictures, I'm speaking stream of consciousness here, that they will starve out whoever's in the airport now? They will ring it and disallow supplies to get through. And however long it takes for the Americans to evacuate who's ever on premises is about it. But those who are sheltering in place throughout Kabul and the rest of Afghanistan, there's no chance to cherry pick them. That's it. They're just going to have to stay.
The head of Central Command, General McKenzie, talked with the Taliban in the last couple of days and made it clear that the U.S. was trying to engage in an orderly withdrawal, that it was a withdrawal, that there have been reports that they brokered some kind of deal. What it involves is not clear. I don't think that, I suspect the Taliban will let others leave. The question is, what kind of repercussions will there be? How hard will they make it? And what happens to those left behind? The great fear is that there will be some kind of slaughter, some kind of purging, weeding out of those who facilitated or helped the United States and its allies.
And then there is the notion that the Taliban, through its spokespeople, whether they be in country or in Doha, have said, and I'll paraphrase, we are a different Taliban than 20 years ago. Gone are the medieval cowboys that would just lop people's heads off for sport. And now is a Taliban that wants a world stage and maybe wants to be part, of some kind of UN recognition and really wants to be the older, more mature and disciplined force that they believe themselves to be. Do you believe that this new Taliban may actually be less merciless than we think and may actually be more willing to recognize some women's rights?
Probably not. One of the problems is the Taliban is not a homogenous single group. It has many of its own factions, some of them harder line, more ruthless, others of them willing to engage in peace talks with that involve the United States. They have said repeatedly that they're going to allow women to engage in education. The question, of course, is, does that mean that girls can learn their ABCs, their 2+2s, or does that mean that they have to go through religious education only, that they'll be taught what the Quran says? There are so many dangers. The Taliban has not changed its stripes. The question is, which faction dominates? And it is beholden in many ways to the outside world because the West, particularly the United States, provided so much of the aid for development and just to sustain the economy in Afghanistan. If that is cut off, all of it, the Taliban will have a very difficult time economically, supporting themselves. Life is going to change dramatically in Afghanistan, not just because of the political system, but economically as well. The fear is, of course, we're going back to the dark ages and to barbaric practices, the reinstallation of a very strict, rigid Sharia law. But the broader danger is also what happens to the society that we invested in for 20 years and helped 37% of girls learn how to read, where you had an independent media, where you had democratic elections and the transfer of power more than once.
One last question for you, and I think it's an important one because we went to Afghanistan in 2001 to rout al-Qaeda and ensure that the Taliban could never harbor terrorist forces who could do harm against us again. So I think the same question applies here as well to the new Taliban 20 years later. The leaders from Doha will likely be returning soon to Kabul. Presumably we'll have a president of this emirate at some point soon. Are they ever going to risk losing their country again for 20 years by doing something so stupid as harboring people like al-Qaeda?
There's no question that whether it's al-Qaeda or like-minded militants will try to go back to Afghanistan to create bases, to find safe haven, to find a sponsor. Will the Taliban rein them in when it comes to orchestrating terrorist attacks on the West? Perhaps, but there's no question that Afghanistan will become a refuge or a source of base of operations for other extremist groups.
And that is why I call on you. And you are one of the first thoughts when we end up in, situations where we need to figure out what the next few days, months, and years are going to look like. Robin Wright, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, so across the country tonight, U.S. military veterans of this war in Afghanistan and, of course, families who have lost their loved ones there, they're watching the same images on TV that you're watching in Kabul. What do you suppose they're feeling about what they've sacrificed? Anger, frustration, maybe regret? I've got the chance to ask two of them who have lost so much next. Welcome back to our special coverage of the Taliban takeover, wholesale takeover of Afghanistan. The Taliban forces have now pretty much routed the country's capital of Kabul. Didn't take much either. Barely a shot fired, in fact. State Department says there has not been an official transfer of power. But let's be honest, folks, that's just a matter of time. We have seen some pretty awful images today, like these. Afghan residents so desperate to get aboard a transport, they would put themselves in this kind of danger and even cling to it, knowing it's about to take off. Some of them, it is reported, fell from that transport after it took off. In the U.S., lawmakers are grappling now with how the decision to pull U.S. troops out of Afghanistan went so sideways so fast, and what they can possibly say to the U.S. military veterans and their families who sacrificed 20 years of their lives fighting for freedom in Afghanistan, only to see it really just vanish in, honestly, a couple of days. I'm joined by two people who know firsthand the sacrifice that went into the 2-decade-long war in Afghanistan. Kylie Willis is a Gold Star daughter. Her father, U.S. Army Staff Sergeant Kirk Owen, was a leader in the Scout and Sniper Platoon in the Oklahoma Army National Guard's 45th Infantry Brigade Combat Team. And he was killed in action by an improvised explosive device, better known as IED. Travis Mills is a retired United States Army Staff Sergeant who served with the 82nd Airborne. He lost both portions of both arms and legs from an IED while on active duty in Afghanistan, and that was on his third tour in country. To both of you, thank you so much for your service, for your dedication, for what you've sacrificed for this country, and also thank you so much for being here with me tonight. Travis, I'll start with you. Having fought in that country, having lost so much, seeing the pictures you saw today, what were your first thoughts?
My heart goes out for the Afghan people that that were on our side, that helped us through, getting around the countryside, speaking the language, interpreting, and things like that. You feel awful for them, but I also need to make sure that the people that did serve understand, like, hey, we did something good. Not everything was lost because of the last 10 days. And, we built schools. We did give a chance to little girls to go to school and get educated. We built wells and we made sure they had fresh drinking water. And I think it needs to be known to all the veterans out there that are suffering from this and wondering what was it all for, that we did do something good. But I'll tell you, my first deployment I went on, I was over there, ready to do whatever I had to do, right? I was an infantry guy, kick doors in, beat the bad guys down. And after that, you realize I'm really just here for the guy, to my right and my left, for the American soldier. And all we wanted to ever do was get home. So, we carried the missions out. We cared when we were there, but at the end of the day, we just wanted to come home back to the States. Unfortunately, this day was going to happen where we pulled out. And this is just a horrible planning operation that went awry because, we had to come home eventually. And I did lose both arms and legs, but I got some cool tricks out of it.
Well, you are one of the more positive people I think I've ever met, Travis. Honestly, I can't even believe you and I are both smiling, but that's testament to your remarkable will and your honor and your courage and your bravery. Kylie, I think we can call you brave as well. You're a Gold Star daughter. You lost your father. And a lot of veterans and a lot of Gold Star families are repeating the same phrase, for what? And then you hear Travis saying what he's saying. I'd love to get your thoughts.
I wholeheartedly agree with Travis. It might be a little surprising, but, the past 24 hours have been a roller coaster of emotions and just processing through everything. Understanding that what my dad did and what he believed in meant something. It wasn't all for naught. And that's, I think, one of the most important things is, not that the country has fallen, not that terrorists are back in charge, but what do we do here to continue to show our veterans and our Gold Star and surviving families the support and the honor that they deserve for the sacrifices that they've made?
And Kylie, you and Travis both are working for foundations that offer assistance to veterans who are returning, as well as their families. Have you heard from many of those veterans and family members, their reactions on this just such distressing news and certainly distressing images?
Personally, on my Facebook, I've had many soldiers that my dad served with reach out to me today just to offer their condolences and their support and to let me know that they were thinking of me. I have a bunch of our families that we serve on my Facebook as well, and it's just been a bunch of heartache and trying to understand, what happened and why. I think many of us knew that this day was coming, but it kind of hit you hard whenever it was a little unexpected. It's almost like the end of an era. I'm 25 years old, and my whole life we've been at war in Afghanistan, and that's finally coming to an end. And, it was really important for me to remember this morning that my dad's life meant more than dying in a war. He was more than just a soldier. And I think that's really important to help remind other Gold Star and surviving families that their soldier, will live on past this war.
Yeah, I think your father, U.S. Army Staff Sergeant Kirk Owen, I'll repeat his name, would be extraordinarily proud of you, Kylie. I hope my kids turn out to be half of what you're like. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, I want to ask you if you had an opportunity to say something directly to the president, what would it be? Because after the break, you're going to have that opportunity to say something directly to the president. Back right after this. This is how the day began, with those who were clambering over walls to get into the airport, and those below in black turbans, presumably Taliban, just shooting at them. And this is how the day ended. Shots being fired in the dark skies on the tarmac at the airport to disperse the crowds. Those with telephones doing our coverage for us because it is just so difficult to be there as journalists. Indeed, many journalists have left. Still with me, retired United States Army Staff Sergeant Travis Mills, who lost portions of both arms and legs from an IED attack while serving in Afghanistan, and Gold Star daughter Kylie Willis, whose father, U.S. Army Staff Sergeant Kirk Owen, died 10 years ago this month. So, Travis, I understand that some of the veterans that you've been talking to have been getting notes from people who were helping U.S. Fighters, some of the support staff. They've been getting notes with goodbye messages from people in country. Have you heard more about that?
I haven't personally heard anything about that. I just think that it's important that, people like Kylie understand the reason I keep going forward every day with no arms, no legs is because of the sacrifice that her father and so many of my, battle buddies made. And I think I'm blessed to still be alive. And unfortunately, what's going on in Afghanistan right now really isn't fair for the people of Afghanistan, but also the veterans that fought there. And, my big thing, I know you said, what would I say before the break, you said, what would I say to the president? In truth, I probably wouldn't say anything too much to the president. I don't think he would have his ears open to want to listen to a guy like me. Whereas I talked to Donald Trump and I told Donald Trump, rules of engagement are really getting people hurt overseas. And within 2 weeks, the rules of engagement, they changed. when I was sitting in the Oval Office and telling him that. So, you know, we have the Travis Mills Foundation to bring out combat and service-connected injured veterans. Some might do things adaptively. I live a very positive life. I have a wife and 2 kids. My son's 4-year-old birthday party is tomorrow. He turns 4. But I just am so honored that I was able to live through my injuries. And I want to let, you know, Kylie know and everybody out there that's a Gold Star Merit family that I keep going forward because I'm so thankful and I understand the sacrifice I could have made. And I think it'd be selfish if I give up on myself.
It's amazing. You're one of only 5 quadruple amputees from the wars in both Iraq and Afghanistan to have survived your injuries. It's remarkable. Kylie, do you want to jump in on that as well? The opportunity to, you know, a message for the president in the circumstances we're in right now?
You know, at a time like this, I think my message would be less to the president and more to the American people that, you know, it's a time to come together once again. It's a time to support each other and to support those families and those veterans that, you know, have sacrificed so much, like we've been talking about this whole time. And, you know, Travis, it means so much to know that us healing and growing and surviving our tragedy helps you survive yours too. So it's truly a two-way street. So I think the most important part in picking up the pieces here is continuing to support those that are still here, that have made those sacrifices, and let them know that this isn't the end of their story. This is just, you know, an unfortunate roadblock, and we're still here. We still love you, and we're here to support you.
You're both remarkable. Honestly, I don't have the words, and I'm a broadcaster. That should tell you something. Thank you to both of you, Kylie Willis and Travis Mills, both for being here tonight and for your service and insights. And thank you, everyone, for being with us as well for this edition of Banfield. We'll see you again tomorrow night.